They would later say the moment the Admiral's pulse flatlined, the room felt colder, like the air itself had realized something was terribly wrong. But long before that happened, long before alarms screamed and rank meant nothing, no one at Fort Harrington Naval Medical Center gave a second glance to the quiet American nurse standing against the wall, the one with her hands folded, eyes lowered, and posture so carefully small it bordered on invisible, because to them, Nurse Sarah Whitaker was just another background figure in a hospital full of louder personalities, sharper elbows, and higher ranks. A woman in her mid-30s who spoke only when spoken to, avoided the doctor's lounge like a minefield, and flinched just a half-second too late when metal trays clattered to the floor, a detail the residents mocked without understanding that her nervous system had been trained in places where sudden sounds meant incoming fire, not clumsy interns. Sarah worked nights by choice, volunteered for overflow shifts, and never once complained when surgeons snapped at her or blamed her for mistakes they themselves had made, earning her a reputation as weak, passive, and forgettable, the kind of nurse administrators love because she never caused friction and the kind doctors dismissed because she never fought back. She's nice, they said, which in hospital language often meant inconsequential. Her personnel file was thin, almost suspiciously so, an American nursing license, excellent evaluations, no disciplinary notes, and a gap of several years marked only with the vague phrase prior federal service, a line no one bothered to question because people assumed it meant paperwork work, or maybe a desk job somewhere unremarkable. If anyone had actually watched her closely, they might have noticed the way her eyes constantly tracked exits, the way she positioned herself instinctively near solid cover, or how her hands, though calm when starting IVs, bore faint scars that didn't come from clumsy needle sticks. But nobody watched Sarah Whitaker closely, not until the weak Admiral Thomas Kearns arrived. The Admiral's visit had thrown the hospital into controlled chaos. Corridors were scrubbed until they gleamed, command staff hovered like nervous birds, and physicians straightened their coats as if rank might be contagious. Admiral Kearns was a legend in the Navy, brilliant, demanding, respected, and his presence alone made people stand taller, speak sharper, and hide their mistakes better. But to Sarah, he was just another patient body waiting to fail in one of 1,000 possible ways. She noticed things others didn't during his initial intake, the faint stiffness in his gait, the way his breathing lagged a fraction behind his speech, the barely perceptible tremor in his left hand that vanished when he clenched it into a fist, observations she logged quietly and mentally flagged, though she knew better than to voice them without being asked, because experience had taught her that in civilian hospitals, nurses who spoke out of turn were labeled problems. During rounds, as cardiologists debated stress tests and officers chatted about logistics, Sarah stood near the back of the room, silent, invisible, remembering other rooms, other bodies, other moments where silence had been the difference between life and death, because before she was Nurse Whitaker, she had been Staff Sergeant Whitaker, United States Marine Corps, combat trauma specialist attached to a forward operating unit in Helmand Province, where she'd learned to triage wounds under fire, stabilize catastrophic injuries with limited supplies, and make decisions in seconds that civilians spent years debating in conference rooms. She had learned how the human body failed when pushed past design limits, how shock presented before monitors caught it, how leadership sounded when it was real and when it was just noise, and she had also learned what it cost to carry that knowledge home, which was why she had left the Marines quietly, declined interviews, declined ceremonies, changed hospitals twice, and chosen anonymity over medals, because anonymity was safer. On the morning of the Admiral's scheduled briefing, the hospital auditorium filled with uniforms and titles, and Sarah was assigned to stand along the side wall, monitoring vitals discreetly, a task she accepted without comment even as a resident whispered that it was overkill to have a nurse babysitting a healthy 4-star officer. As the briefing droned on, Sarah's attention drifted not to the slides, but to the Admiral himself, noting the sheen of sweat at his temple, the way he paused mid-sentence just a beat too long, the subtle hitch in his inhale that set off a quiet internal alarm she didn't yet voice, because she had learned restraint the hard way. Around her, officers shifted, pens scratched, phones buzzed, and no one noticed when Admiral Kearns' hand tightened against the podium, when his shoulders tensed as if bracing for impact, or when his gaze unfocused for the briefest moment, But Sarah noticed, because once upon a time, noticing had been her only job, and she felt that old, unwelcome sensation crawling up her spine, the one that said this is about to go bad. She took one step forward, then stopped herself, remembering where she was, remembering that here she was just a nurse, just Sarah, just another quiet woman in scrubs who didn't make waves. And as the Admiral cleared his throat to continue speaking, she lowered her eyes again, unaware that in less than 10 minutes, the room would erupt, the monitors would scream, and every person who had overlooked her would suddenly be depending on the very skills they never imagined she possessed, because the quiet nurse no one respected was about to become the only thing standing between an admiral's life and death. No one realized anything was wrong at first, which was the most dangerous part, because Admiral Thomas Kearns was still on his feet, still speaking, still holding the room with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded fleets, even as his body began betraying him in subtle, catastrophic ways that only one person in the auditorium seemed to register. And while the doctors lining the back wall watched the clock and the officers in the front row nodded along, Nurse Sarah Whitaker felt her focus narrow until the world shrank to the Admiral's chest, his neck, the way his breaths had grown shallow and uneven, a pattern she had seen before in places far less polished than this, places where hesitation had meant body bags. The Admiral's voice faltered mid-sentence, his hands slipping from the podium as if the wood had suddenly turned slick, and there was a beat of confused silence before he staggered, knees buckling, his body pitching forward in a way that drew gasps but not yet panic, because high-ranking men weren't supposed to fall apart in public, and for half a second the room seemed to wait for him to recover out of respect alone. But Sarah was already moving. She crossed the distance without running, dropping to her knees beside him as aides shouted for medics, and someone yelled to clear space, her hands finding his carotid pulse before the words had fully left their mouths, and she felt it. Weak, irregular, slipping, while the Admiral's eyes fluttered, unfocused, his lips tinged with a grayish blue that no lighting condition could explain away. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked quietly, her voice steady even as her pulse spiked. And when he didn't respond, when his chest hitched and then stalled, the room finally erupted. Doctors surged forward, rank collided with protocol, orders overlapped, and someone dragged a crash cart into the aisle with a screech that echoed off the walls. But chaos was loud, and Sarah had learned to work inside it, not contribute to it. She adjusted the Admiral's airway, tilted his head just enough to ease breathing, her eyes never leaving his chest as monitors were slapped on and numbers began flashing in angry red and yellow. "We've got arrhythmia," a cardiologist announced unnecessarily, already prepping meds, while another doctor called for oxygen and a third argued about dosage. And in the middle of it all, Sarah noticed what none of them did. The way the Admiral's right side lagged when his chest rose, the faint bulge forming near his clavicle, the rapid deterioration that didn't match a simple cardiac event. She opened her mouth once, closed it, then tried again. "Something's wrong with his breathing," she said, not loud enough to cut through the noise, and she was ignored, brushed aside by a resident who muttered, "Let the doctors handle it," a phrase that would have sounded laughable in another life. The Admiral convulsed slightly, his back arching, and the monitor screamed as his heart rhythm dissolved into a flat, merciless line, the sound slicing through the room and finally silencing every argument, every rank-driven hesitation, because death did not care about hierarchy. "We've lost him," someone said, unnecessarily again, and hands moved to start CPR, compressions heavy and uneven, while epinephrine was drawn up and defibrillator pads were slapped onto his chest. But Sarah saw the problem as clearly as if it were outlined in red, saw that restarting his heart wouldn't matter if his lungs couldn't function, if pressure was collapsing his airway from the inside. "Stop," she said, louder this time, and a few heads turned, annoyance flickering across faces that did not want input from a nurse at this moment. But she didn't wait for permission, didn't wait for consensus, because in combat medicine, consensus was a luxury and time was an enemy. She reached for the kit clipped to the crash cart, her hands moving with a precision that surprised the people closest to her, selecting a large-bore needle as if it were the only logical choice in the world. And when a resident finally snapped, "What are you doing?" her answer was calm and terrifying in its certainty. "If we don't relieve the pressure in his chest right now, None of this matters. She landmarked his rib space by touch alone, ignoring the shouting, ignoring the hands that reached to stop her, because she had done this before on dirt floors and helicopter decks, and once in the back of a moving truck under fire. And when she drove the needle home, and the trapped air hissed free, the sound cut through the room sharper than any alarm. The room did not erupt into applause or cheers when the Admiral's pulse stabilized, because moments like that carried too much weight for celebration, and instead what settled over the auditorium was a stunned, almost reverent quiet as doctors slowly stepped back, staring at the monitors as if afraid the numbers might vanish if they blinked too hard, while Nurse Sarah Whitaker remained kneeling at the Admiral's side, one hand still resting lightly against his neck, eyes focused, breathing steady, already transitioning from crisis to aftercare with the practiced calm of someone who knew the fight wasn't over just because the heart was beating again. Orders resumed, but now they flowed through her, not around her, physicians asking instead of telling, waiting for her nod before moving, and no one questioned it because authority had shifted in a way that didn't need to be announced. When the Admiral was finally stabilized and wheeled out under heavy guard, the room exhaled collectively, and only then did the questions begin, quiet at first, then louder, edged with disbelief, as senior doctors replayed what had just happened and realized they had nearly lost a 4-star officer by treating symptoms instead of causes. A captain in dress uniform approached Sarah, his expression unreadable, and asked her where she had learned to perform a combat-only procedure with such confidence. And for a moment she considered deflecting, slipping back into anonymity the way she always did. But something in the room had changed, something irreversible, and she answered simply, United States Marine Corps, the words landing heavier than any rank insignia. That was all it took. Phones came out. Calls were made. A sealed personnel file was requested and opened for the first time in years, and within minutes, the quiet nurse everyone had dismissed became a subject of hushed conversation as titles and deployments surfaced. Combat Trauma Specialist, Forward Operating Unit, multiple tours, commendations no one had bothered to look for. When the Admiral regained consciousness later that evening, pale but alive, he asked one question before anything else. Who saved me? And when Sarah was brought into the room, still in scrubs, still trying to shrink herself out of habit, he studied her with the sharp clarity of a man who understood command and survival intimately, then reached out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. You didn't hesitate, he said, voice rough. That tells me everything. By morning, the hospital felt different, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the lesson, and Sarah moved through it no longer invisible, no longer ignored, but she didn't bask in it, didn't correct people when they stood a little straighter around her or lowered their voices, because she had never wanted recognition, only competence, only the chance to do the job right. When offered commendations, press interviews, even a return to active advisory duty, she declined most of it quietly, choosing instead to remain where she was, training staff, rewriting emergency protocols, ensuring that the next time a life hung in the balance, fewer people would miss the signs she'd been trained to see. She still worked nights. She still spoke softly. She still stood near the exits. But no one mistook her silence for weakness again, because everyone at Fort Harrington knew the truth now. The quiet nurse wasn't quiet because she was afraid. She was quiet because she had learned, long ago, that the loudest person in the room was rarely the one who saved lives.